In a forgotten subway station, Keanu Reeves sits beside a homeless veteran playing a broken harmonica. The man says he's been waiting 25 years for a boy he once saved, without knowing that boy is sitting right beside him. What happens next will uncover a promise kept across decades and leave you in tears. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The subway station smelled of wet concrete and tired dreams. Keanu stepped off the last stair into the dim underground corridor, his boots echoing against the cracked tile floor. The charity filming was supposed to happen near the main platform, a quick interview about homelessness awareness, a few shots for the foundation's new campaign. But Keanu barely made it 20 feet before something stopped him. Thin, frail, almost swallowed by the cavernous station, but somehow stronger than all the rushing footsteps and passing trains. The slow, aching notes of a harmonica. Keanu turned toward the source. Tucked into a corner by a broken vending machine was an old man, hunched over, his battered duffel bag sitting at his feet. His jacket was threadbare, his boots mismatched. His hair was white, tangled, and his face was a roadmap of decades spent surviving. But his hands, though worn, moved with surprising tenderness over the small, dented harmonica. He wasn't playing for coins. There was no hat, no cup, no sign. He was playing for no one, and maybe for everyone. Keanu found himself rooted in place, the camera crew's distant voices forgotten. The man's music wasn't polished. It wasn't showy. It was raw, broken, beautiful. Keanu listened, feeling something stir deep inside him, something he couldn't quite name. People hurried by, glancing at the man without really seeing him. A mother tugged her child closer. A businessman muttered under his breath. A security guard looked over, but didn't approach. Keanu watched it all, the way the world moved past him, past the music, as if it didn't exist. Something about that broke Keanu's heart. Without thinking, he turned and walked back up the station steps to the street above. A coffee shop stood just a block away. He went inside, ordered 2 hot coffees, and stood waiting, his foot tapping restlessly against the floor. When the cups were ready, he grabbed them both and hurried back down into the station. The man was still there, still playing, still invisible. Keanu approached slowly, careful not to startle him. When he reached the bench, he extended one of the coffees without a word. The man looked up, surprised. His eyes were pale blue, clouded at the edges but sharp beneath the layers of time. For a second, Keanu thought he might refuse. But then the man reached out with a shaking hand and accepted it. Keanu sat down beside him, still silent, still holding his own cup. The harmonica slipped quietly into the man's lap. They sat like that for a long moment. 2 strangers, 2 coffees. No noise except the distant rumble of trains and the lingering memory of the song that had drawn Keanu in like a thread across time. The old man lifted the coffee to his lips, cradling it between his hands like it was something fragile, something sacred. He took a careful sip, then leaned back against the cold tile wall, letting out a soft sigh that said more than any words could. Keanu didn't speak right away. He just sat there, breathing in the heavy scent of subway air, the coffee warming his hands, the silence between them settling into something almost comfortable. After a while, the man glanced over, studying Keanu with a wary kind of curiosity. "You don't gotta buy me anything," he said, his voice rough as gravel but carrying a note of quiet dignity. Keanu shook his head gently. "Not buying anything," he said. "Just figured you might want some company." The man huffed a short breath, something between a laugh and a scoff. He looked down at the harmonica resting in his lap, thumb tracing one of the deep dents along its edge. "Company," he muttered. "That's a rare thing down here." Keanu smiled softly. Maybe it's time for rare things. The old man's mouth twitched, the faintest ghost of a smile trying to break through. For a moment, they sat like that, sipping coffee, watching the endless flow of people. Rush, blur, forget. But here, on this cracked old bench, tucked behind a broken vending machine, time moved differently. The man turned the harmonica over in his hand, almost absently, like muscle memory more than thought. "Name's Frank," he said finally. Keanu reached out and shook his hand, firm and steady. "Keanu," Frank chuckled, low and hoarse. "Like the actor?" Keanu's grin widened. "Yeah, something like that." Frank shook his head, amusement flickering in his eyes for a brief second, before the tiredness settled back in. "You one of them TV people here for the charity thing?" he asked, nodding vaguely toward the distant commotion near the platform. Keanu nodded. "Yeah, but I think maybe I was supposed to meet you instead." Frank gave him a long, searching look, as if weighing that answer carefully. Then, slowly, he lifted the harmonica to his lips again. This time, he played softer, lower, a tune that drifted through the station like smoke, curling around the pillars and stairwells, weaving through the noise of the trains and the buzz of the crowd. It wasn't a happy song, but it wasn't a sad one either. It was a song of surviving, of remembering, of waiting for something, or someone, long past the time most people would have given up. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, letting the music seep into him. He didn't know why yet, but something about Frank's song felt familiar, deeply familiar, as if somewhere long ago he had heard it before, or maybe been saved by it. When Frank finished playing, he lowered the harmonica into his lap again and stared out across the empty tracks. Neither of them spoke for a while. Keanu didn't want to break whatever fragile thread had formed between them. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, matching Frank's stillness. Finally, Frank spoke, voice low. "You ever lose someone?" he asked, eyes fixed on the far wall. Keanu thought about it. Thought about the faces he had lost over the years. Friends, family, people whose absence left gaps you couldn't explain to anyone else. "Yeah," Keanu said quietly. "I have." Frank nodded slowly, as if he already knew the answer. "Funny thing about loss," Frank murmured. "Some folks carry it like a scar. Some folks carry it like a song." Keanu watched him, the harmonica glinting faintly under the fluorescent lights. "Which one are you?" Keanu asked gently. Frank smiled, a broken, beautiful smile. "I try to carry it like a song," he said. "Some days it still sounds like noise." Keanu felt a lump rise in his throat, but swallowed it back. He looked down at the battered harmonica, the duffel bag at Frank's feet, the way his hands rested on his knees like he was still waiting for something, or someone, to find him. "You play for yourself?" Keanu asked. Frank shook his head. "Not anymore." "Then who?" Keanu pressed softly. Frank didn't answer at first. He just stared out at the tracks, the way people sometimes stare at the ocean, trying to remember something they never quite forgot. "Boy," Frank said finally. "Long time ago." Keanu stayed still, heart starting to beat a little faster without knowing why. "Accident down here," Frank continued. "Bus crash, smoke everywhere, people screaming. I found a kid, maybe 8, maybe 9 years old, pinned under a bench." He paused, running a hand over his weathered face. "Probably drunk." "I pulled him out, sat with him until help came, played this damn harmonica so he wouldn't be scared." Keanu's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I never caught his name," Frank said. "He just called me the man with the harmonica." Keanu felt the breath leave his lungs. Somewhere deep in his mind he could hear it. Not the sound of the crash, not the screaming, just a soft, trembling harmonica playing a broken little lullaby under the flickering subway lights. Frank glanced over, noticing Keanu's expression. "You okay, son?" he asked, a flicker of concern crossing his tired features. Keanu forced a smile and nodded. He wasn't ready to say anything yet. Not until he was sure. Not until the song that connected them was ready to be played all the way through. Instead, he lifted his coffee cup and clinked it gently against Frank's. "To the man with the harmonica," Keanu said softly. Frank smiled back, a little surprised, a little touched. And together, without another word, they sat in the forgotten heart of the city, letting a memory 25 years old begin to stir. Frank wrapped his hands tighter around the coffee cup, as if trying to absorb the warmth into his bones. The harmonica rested quietly between them on the bench, its dull silver catching the flickering station lights. Keanu leaned back, giving Frank space. He didn't press. He didn't pry. He just waited. Sometimes, silence opened doors faster than questions ever could. After a few minutes, Frank cleared his throat. Been a long time since someone just sat down, he said, voice rough. Keanu smiled slightly. Maybe it's been too long. Frank chuckled, a short, dry sound. He tapped his fingernail lightly against the coffee cup, thinking. You from around here? Frank asked, not looking over. Keanu shrugged. Close enough. Frank nodded like he understood, even if he didn't. Another stretch of silence. Another rumble of a passing train. Finally, Frank spoke again, voice softer now. Used to have a house, he said. Wife, baby girl, all of it. He didn't say what happened. Keanu didn't ask. Frank shook his head, more to himself than anyone else. Went to Vietnam, did what I had to do, came back, and nothing was the same. His hand tightened around the cup, the knuckles going white. World moved on without me, Frank said, and I didn't know how to move with it. Keanu listened, every muscle in his body tilt. Had some bad years, Frank admitted. Didn't treat people right. Didn't treat myself right, neither. He looked down at the harmonica again. This little thing kept me sane, gave me something to hold on to when there wasn't much else. Keanu felt a deep ache stir in his chest. Music. It always came back to music. Frank rubbed a hand over his weathered face, sighing. Most folks don't see it, he said. They look right through you, like you're a ghost already. Keanu's voice was quiet. I see you. Frank looked at him then, really looked, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Something raw, something real. Frank nodded once, a small gesture of gratitude he didn't have the words to say. He took another careful sip of coffee, then leaned back against the cold tiles, staring up at the stained ceiling. Saved a kid once, he said after a long while, almost to himself. Long time ago. Keanu's heart skipped. Bus crash, Frank murmured. Right here. Smoke, fire, it was bad. He closed his eyes, lost in the memory. Found him under a bench, Frank whispered. Thought he was gone at first. He opened his eyes again, blinking against something that wasn't the light. But he wasn't. Just scared, hurt. Needed someone. Keanu swallowed hard, saying nothing. I sat with him, Frank said. Played him a song on the harmonica. Thought maybe he'd remember the song, if not, the man. He smiled sadly. Maybe it'd make him less afraid. Keanu's hands tightened around his coffee cup. The song. The harmonica. The subway. It was all starting to fit together. Frank shifted on the bench, wincing a little as he adjusted his worn boots. Keanu caught the movement, the way Frank's whole body seemed to carry the weight of years too heavy to bear alone. You ever wonder, Frank said quietly, if the good you try to do even matters? Keanu tilted his head slightly, not rushing to answer. Frank rubbed the side of his face, as if trying to wipe the memory away. That boy. After they pulled him out of here, I never saw him again. Never got a name. Never got a thanks. Not that I needed one. He shrugged, but the motion was heavy. Just. Sometimes I wonder if he made it. If he grew up okay. If he even remembers that old fool with the busted harmonica. Keanu felt the sting behind his eyes and blinked it back. Frank's gaze dropped to his harmonica again. Lost a lot of things over the years, he said. Family, friends, places I called home. He tapped the harmonica once against his knee. But that night, saving that kid, it's the one thing I held on to. Keanu leaned forward slightly, Why here? Why come back? Frank smiled thinly, no humor in it. Because I promised. Keanu frowned. Promised who? Frank looked up, his eyes watery but sharp. Promised myself, he said. Promised I'd be here? Just in case. He laughed, a brittle sound. Sounds stupid now, don't it? Some old man sitting here week after week, year after year, waiting for a ghost. Keanu shook his head slowly. It's not stupid. Frank studied him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he meant it. Then he chuckled again, softer this time. Most people don't wait anymore, Frank said. They move on, find something easier to believe in. Keanu's voice was steady. Maybe it's the ones who wait who change everything. Frank's expression shifted, just a flicker, but Keanu saw it. Saw the part of him that still wanted to believe it was true. He took another sip of his cooling coffee. You play every Tuesday? Keanu asked. Frank nodded. Every Tuesday. Same time? Give or take, Frank said with a shrug. Got no place better to be. Keanu smiled quietly. Then maybe I'll join you. Frank raised an eyebrow, half amused. You play? Keanu laughed. Not a note. Frank chuckled, low in his throat. Then you listen. Keanu lifted his cup in a silent toast. Gladly. They sat there, two coffees growing cold in their hands, the hume of the subway alive around them. For the first time in a long time, Frank wasn't invisible. And Keanu knew, deep in his bones, that this was just the beginning. The beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, but that neither could walk away from now. Not after 25 years. Not after a song that refused to be forgotten. Frank shifted the harmonica back into his hand and turned it slowly, the way someone might handle a relic from another life. You know, he said, his voice distant, I used to be someone else. Keanu watched him closely, letting the story unfold without pushing. Had a job, a place to go every morning. Had people who waited for me to come home at night. Frank smiled faintly. And then, Vietnam happened. His smile faded. I came back, but I didn't come back the same, Frank said. You hear that a lot, but living it's different. Keanu nodded quietly, offering no interruption. I used to have this dream, Frank continued, staring into the distance. I'd be back over there, in the jungle, could feel the mud under my boots, hear the choppers overhead, and I'd be running, always running. But no matter how fast I moved, I couldn't reach my brother. Keanu felt the weight of the words settle heavy between them. He was younger than me, Frank said, voice cracking slightly. Followed me everywhere as a kid. Always trusted me to get him home safe. Frank blinked hard, clearing the mist from his eyes. I didn't, he said simply. I failed him. Keanu leaned forward a little, his heart breaking for the man beside him. You didn't fail, Keanu said softly. You survived. Frank smiled bitterly. Some days, that's the hardest part. He looked down at the harmonica again. After the war, I couldn't stand silence, he said. Too loud, too many ghosts. He lifted the harmonica to his lips and blew a soft, broken note. This little thing kept them at bay. Keanu closed his eyes for a second, letting the sound wash over him. A station announcement crackled over the intercom, distorted and distant, but neither of them moved. Frank played another short phrase, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a song exactly. It was a memory, a conversation with the past. We meant that bus crashed, Frank said, lowering the harmonica again. I didn't think, just moved. He smiled a little. Training, maybe, or maybe just dumb luck. Keanu smiled too, feeling something tighten in his chest. Pulled that boy out, Frank continued, sat with him while the paramedics came. He shook his head, a ghost of wonder in his expression. Hell was brave, Frank said. Scared, but brave. Never let go of my hand. Keanu swallowed hard, his throat dry. Frank looked over, his pale blue eyes sharp despite everything life had thrown at him. Sometimes, he said, you don't need to know someone's name to remember them. Keanu nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he agreed. "It's the music that remembers for us." Frank smiled then, a real smile this time. And without a word, he lifted the harmonica and began to play again. Sobbed to address at the table. A song stitched together from sorrow, hope, and the unbreakable thread between two souls who had once found each other in the darkness and were finding each other again. That night, after leaving the subway station, Keanu sat in his small office at the Foundation headquarters, staring at the glow of his laptop screen. The memory of Frank's harmonica still echoed faintly in his ears, a ghostly melody he couldn't shake. Without overthinking it, Keanu opened the community forum the Foundation had built, a quiet place where people could share stories of hope, resilience, and second chances. He clicked on the New Post button and let his fingers find the words. He didn't use Frank's real name. He didn't mention the exact station. He just told the truth, the heart of it. He wrote about a man who waited, a man who once pulled a frightened boy from wreckage and played a broken tune to calm him down, a man who lost almost everything, but never lost his belief in promises made under the worst circumstances. And he ended the post with a simple question. Have you ever met someone who changed your life without even knowing it? He hit post and leaned back, feeling the weight of the day settle deep into his bones. For a few minutes, the screen stayed quiet. Then, slowly, comments began to appear. First a trickle, then a flood. People from all over the country, even different parts of the world, typing out moments they'd carried for years without ever speaking them aloud. "I was in a car accident when I was 12, one woman wrote. "A stranger pulled me out before the car caught fire. I never got to thank him. I think about him every birthday. My high school janitor once sat with me after my mom didn't show up for a recital," another post read. "He didn't say much. He just stayed until my uncle came. I never forgot," a man shared. "When I was homeless, a lady used to bring me sandwiches and a paperback book every week. I don't even know her name, but I'm alive today because she treated me like a person." Keanu scrolled slowly, absorbing every story like a prayer. Story after story of small moments that became lifelines. Story after story of people who didn't know the difference they made, and maybe never would. But they mattered. They mattered more than they would ever understand. Keanu sat there for a long time, his heart aching in that beautiful, bittersweet way he had come to recognize. The ache of something bigger than pain, bigger than loss. The ache of meaning. Keanu continued scrolling, each comment a small testament to how deeply unseen kindness could carve its way into someone's life. One caught his eye and made him pause longer than the others. It was short, only a single sentence. "Some people save you just by being there when no one else was." He read it again and again. It struck something deep in him, something he hadn't put words to yet about Frank, about that day in the subway, about so many moments across his own life when a simple presence, not advice, not solutions, just presence, had been enough to hold him together. He thought back to his own childhood, to the chaos, to the fear. He thought about the hands that had pulled him out of wreckage before he even understood what had happened. Hands that didn't ask for thanks. Hands that disappeared back into the noise without ever asking for anything. Rick. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his fingers steepled together. Maybe Frank had waited all these years thinking he failed someone. Maybe he thought he hadn't mattered. But the truth was, he had mattered more than he could ever know. Keanu closed his eyes, breathing in slowly, letting the comments wash over him like quiet music. Stories poured in faster now. A man remembering a neighbor who fixed his bicycle every time it broke. A woman recalling a teacher who slipped her a note that said, "You are enough," during the worst year of her life. A veteran describing the night a stranger gave him a blanket and stayed with him until morning. Hundreds of lives changed not by grand gestures, but by the smallest acts of humanity. Keanu realized then that the subway wasn't just a place where Frank waited. It was a place where something had been passed on, like a thread, stitched between two broken parts of the world. A thread that never broke. Keanu smiled, a soft, private thing. He typed a reply under the post, not as the actor, not even as someone famous, just as another person who had once been saved without realizing it at the time. Sometimes you don't know you've been saved until much later, and sometimes you're saving someone else without even realizing it. Keep showing up. It matters. He hit send and leaned back. The screen blurred a little as his eyes watered, but he didn't wipe them away. Some things deserved to be felt fully. The sound of a harmonica, the weight of a stranger's kindness, the invisible hands that pulled you through when you didn't know how to stand. As the night stretched on, Keanu kept reading. Each story added another thread to the unseen tapestry connecting strangers across time, space, and pain. It struck him how many people owed their survival to someone who might never even know. An EMT who spoke gently during a rescue. A stranger who stood between a girl and a bully in middle school. A taxi driver who sat silently while a young man cried in the back seat after losing his father. It wasn't the big flashy rescues that stayed with people. It was the simple ones. The moments when someone chose not to look away. Keanu leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a moment, letting the emotion settle in his chest. Somewhere in this vast, spinning world, Frank sat alone, thinking he was forgotten. But he wasn't. Not by Keanu. Not by the boy he saved. Not by the countless others who would hear his story now and remember their own silent heroes. Keanu clicked open a fresh post, hands steady, heart full. He wrote, "If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered if what you did mattered, this is your proof. It did. It does. It always will." He'd posted it without hesitation. The responses were instant. "Thank you for reminding us. I'm crying reading this. I needed it tonight. I thought no one remembered what my grandfather did. Maybe they do." The stories began to weave into something larger than grief. Larger than loss. A collective memory of unseen saviors carried by the people they touched. Keanu closed the laptop slowly and sat in the quiet. He thought about Frank sitting with that small boy years ago, playing a battered harmonica into the smoke and the fear. He thought about how Frank didn't need to know right away who that boy had grown into. All he needed to know was that it had mattered, that it had been enough. Tomorrow, Keanu would go back to the subway. Tomorrow, he would sit again beside the man with the harmonica. And maybe soon, when the moment was right, he would find a way to tell Frank the truth. For now, though, he carried the music of these stories inside him, like a lantern against the dark. A reminder that sometimes the smallest moments, the quietest songs, were the ones that changed everything. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sleeping city. Lights flickering, people dreaming, connections unseen, humming in the spaces between them. And somewhere beneath it all, in the cold belly of the subway, a man named Frank still waited, still played, still believed. Keanu smiled softly, hand resting over his heart. Some promises never needed words. Some debts were paid simply by remembering. And some songs, once heard, never truly ended. The city outside Keanu's window hummed with late-night life, but inside his apartment, everything was still. Keanu lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the dim glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the room. Sleep wouldn't come. Not tonight. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it, the faint, trembling notes of a harmonica, weaving through smoke and darkness like a thread, pulling him backward through time. He turned onto his side, pressing a hand over his chest as if that could still the pounding inside. A memory, long buried, had started clawing its way back to the surface. It wasn't a full scene. Not yet. Just flashes. The shriek of metal twisting. The weightless moment of being thrown through the air. The sharp pain when he landed. The screaming. The panic. the unbearable sense of being lost in a world that had shattered into noise and heat. A man had strong, steady hands lifting him from the rubble, cradling him against a chest that smelled of smoke and sweat and something warm. A soft, broken tune rising above the chaos. The harmonica. The man had played it, his fingers trembling but determined, trying to drown out the terror with music. Keanu squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to stay with the memory, to not turn away like he always had when glimpses of that night crept in before. He remembered clutching the man's jacket. I remembered crying into the fabric, too scared to speak. Remembered the harmonicas, song, raw, imperfect, beautiful. It had calmed him more than words ever could have. Keanu opened his eyes again, his heart thudding against his ribs. To really be, could Frank, the man sitting under the flickering lights with a battered harmonica and a tired smile, be the same man who had once pulled him from death? The idea was almost too much to hold. He pushed himself upright, running a hand through his hair. He had to be sure. He needed to be certain before he said anything. What if he was wrong? What if he stirred up hopes in Frank only to crush them again? Keanu stood and paced the room, the wooden floor cool under his bare feet. The memory sharpened further with each step he took. The glint of the harmonica in the emergency lights. The faint melody. An old folk song, one his mother used to hum when she thought no one was listening. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Keanu stopped at the window, staring down at the empty street below. His reflection wavered in the glass, overlaid with the faint memory of a boy gripping a stranger's hand, listening to a song meant to patch a broken world back together. His chest tightened. It was Frank. It had to be. And he had been waiting, all these years, thinking he had failed. Keanu closed his eyes. Not failed, saved. Now the only question was when and how to tell him. Because some truths needed the right moment, and some moments needed a song. Keanu leaned his forehead lightly against the cool window pane, gathering his breath. A part of him wanted to rush to the subway station right now, find Frank and tell him everything. Let him know that the boy he pulled from the wreckage hadn't disappeared into the silence, that he hadn't been forgotten. But another part of him hesitated. Frank had spent decades thinking he was just a shadow in someone else's story, a ghost who once mattered for a moment before fading into nothing. If Keanu said the wrong thing at the wrong time, he could overwhelm the man's fragile sense of peace. Frank wasn't just any stranger to Keanu now. He was a thread woven through Keanu's entire life without either of them knowing it. And unraveling that thread too quickly could hurt more than heal. Keanu turned away from the window and sat down again, elbows resting on his knees. He thought about Frank's hands, worn and calloused, lifting the harmonica with such care. About the way Frank's voice cracked when he spoke of the boy he hoped had survived. Frank didn't need grand gestures. He didn't need a debt repaid. He needed dignity. And dignity wasn't something you handed to someone like a medal. It was something you helped them reclaim on their own terms. Keanu exhaled slowly, the plan starting to form in his mind. He wouldn't tell Frank yet. Not with words. Instead, he would build a bridge back to him, brick by quiet brick, note by soft note. He would meet Frank where he was, where he had always been waiting. In the music. In the silence between songs. In the small acts that said, "I see you. You mattered, you still do." Keanu rose from the chair and walked toward the piano that sat tucked against one wall of his apartment. It was old and a little out of tune, but it had followed him through every place he had called home. He lifted the cover and pressed a key gently. A low, soft note filled the air. Then another. He searched for the melody hidden deep in the memory. Frank's melody. It wasn't perfect. It was raw, unfinished. But it was there, stitched into his mind, like an old photograph he could finally hold again. Keanu played it slowly, feeling the years stretch between him and the boy he had been. feeling the music tie the past and the present together like a knot that could not be undone. Tomorrow, he would go back. Tomorrow, he would sit again beside Frank. And maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to tell him what Frank most needed to hear. Not through speeches, not through tears, through a song, through the memory that had waited in the shadows for 25 years to come home. The next morning, sunlight broke through the clouds over the city, but Keanu barely noticed. He moved through his apartment in a daze, making coffee, feeding the dog, tying his boots, all on autopilot. His mind stayed wrapped around one thought, one image: Frank's weathered face, the slow music from that battered harmonica, and the boy who had once clung to him in the wreckage. Keanu tucked a small notebook into his jacket pocket. He wasn't sure what he was going to say yet. Maybe he wouldn't say anything at all. Maybe it would be enough just to show up. He slipped on a ball cap and sunglasses, more out of habit than necessity, and headed toward the subway station. Every step down those grimy stairs felt heavier than the last. When he reached the platform, the familiar sounds of the city washed over him. The rush of trains, the click of footsteps, the hum of lives moving on without looking back. But Keanu wasn't here to move on. He was here to remember, and to make sure someone else was remembered too. He spotted Frank in his usual spot, a little to the left of the second column, right beneath the flickering light. Same battered duffel bag, same harmonica resting loosely in his hand, same quiet dignity that no years of hardship could erase. Keanu bought 2 coffees from the small stand at the entrance without thinking, one for himself, one for Frank. Then he crossed the platform and sat down beside him, just like he had before. Frank glanced over, his eyes crinkling slightly in recognition. "Tuesday again?" he said, lifting the harmonica slightly in greeting. Keanu smiled. "Wouldn't miss it." They sat for a while in companionable silence. No need to fill the air with words when the music said more. After a few minutes, Frank lifted the harmonica and played a soft, wondering tune. Keanu listened carefully, picking up on the little shifts in tone, the way Frank bent certain notes, the way the rhythm stumbled slightly, then found its footing again. It wasn't perfect. It was real. When Frank finished, Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the notebook he had tucked there that morning. He flipped to a blank page and scribbled a few lines of lyrics, lines that had been echoing in his head all night. Some songs are never forgotten. Some promises never break. He tore the page out carefully and folded it once. Without a word, he slid it across the bench toward Frank. Frank looked down at it, puzzled. He picked it up with fingers that trembled slightly and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the words. He looked up at Keanu, confusion flickering into something deeper, something heavier, something that felt a lot like hope. Keanu just smiled softly and sipped his coffee. There was no rush. Some truths needed time, and some reunions didn't start with explanations. They started with a song. From that morning on, it became a quiet ritual. Every Tuesday, no matter where he was, no matter how busy life became, Keanu found his way back to the subway station. Frank was always there. Same bench. Same weathered harmonica resting loosely in his lap. Some days Frank played. Other days he simply sat, nodding at the people who hurried by without seeing him. But when Keanu arrived, Frank's whole posture changed. Just slightly, just enough to notice. He straightened a little. The worn lines of worry around his eyes softened. Keanu always brought 2 coffees, one black, one with a splash of cream, just the way Frank liked it. They didn't rush conversation. Some days they barely spoke at all. They watched the trains come and go, watched people move through the station like tides. It was enough. On the 3rd Tuesday, Frank leaned back against the pillar, his coffee cradled in both hands. "You know," he said, voice low and rough, "I come here every week hoping to see someone." Keanu turned his head slightly but said nothing, letting Frank set the pace. "Long time ago," Frank continued, "there was a crash, real bad one." He tapped the harmonica absently against his knee. I pulled a boy out of the wreckage, little guy, brave as hell. Keanu's throat tightened, but he kept his face neutral. Frank smiled faintly, staring out at nothing. Called me the man with the harmonica, Frank said, his voice carrying a quiet pride. 8 months. Hannah's name wasn't even on his license. Didn't know my name. I didn't know his. But for a while we were all each other had. Keanu felt something shift deep inside him, an ache so fierce he had to look down to hide it. Frank went on, almost to himself. Promised him he'd be okay, promised him someone would find him, stay with him till they did. His fingers tightened around the harmonica. Kept thinking, maybe someday he'd come back. Maybe he'd remember. Frank shook his head gently, as if at his own foolishness. Crazy old man, huh? Keanu smiled softly. Not crazy, he said. Hopeful. Frank chuckled. A rough, dry sound. Hope'll make you do strange things. Keanu nodded. Yeah, he said. It will. They sat in silence after that, the noise of the city filling in the spaces between them. Keanu didn't need to ask what kept Frank coming back. It wasn't about recognition. It wasn't even about thanks. It was about finishing something that had started in the fire and chaos of that crash. About making sure the promise, the connection, hadn't been lost to the years. Keanu tightened his hand around his coffee cup and stared at the tracks. He would tell Frank the truth. Someday. But for now, he would be there. Every Tuesday. Every time. Until the music that had once saved him could finally come full circle. The weeks slipped by, marked not by calendars or headlines, but by the steady rhythm of Tuesday mornings at the subway station. Each visit carved deeper grooves of trust between Keanu and Frank. Little by little, Frank shared more. Not everything at once, never in a straight line, but in bits and pieces, like someone carefully unwrapping something fragile. He talked about Vietnam, about the jungle heat, the long nights, the sounds that still haunted his dreams, about the brother he couldn't save, his younger brother Danny, lost during a firefight that Frank had replayed 1,000 different ways in his mind. If I'd just turned left instead of right, Frank said once, voice cracking, if I'd just moved faster. Keanu listened without interrupting. He knew grief like that didn't need fixing. It just needed witnessing. Sometimes Frank would pull out his harmonica and play softly, half to himself, half to the ghosts that still followed him. The songs were never the same. Sometimes hopeful, sometimes broken. No, he's honest. Keanu started bringing small things each week. A warm sandwich, a new pair of gloves when the weather turned cold. Once, a battered music book he found at a thrift store, filled with folk songs Frank used to hum between stories. He never made a show of it. He just left the gifts quietly on the bench beside Frank, letting him choose when or if to accept them. Frank always accepted them, with a grunt, with a small nod, with a whispered thanks that carried more weight than a speech ever could. In return, Frank gave Keanu something too, a glimpse into a life that hadn't been erased, only forgotten, a reminder that the people society passed by had stories that mattered, wounds that still ached, songs that still deserved to be heard. One Tuesday, as they sat together watching the trains groan and rattle through the station, Frank spoke without looking over. You ever wonder, he said, what happens to the promises we make when we can't keep them? Keanu turned his coffee cup slowly between his palms. Maybe they just wait, he said, until someone's ready to carry them again. Frank nodded slowly, like he was tucking that answer away to chew on later. They fell back into silence, the kind that didn't feel heavy or awkward, but full. Applause, full of things that didn't need to be said out loud. Full of the music that still lived between them, even without a single note played. Keanu watched Frank out of the corner of his eye. The worn jacket, the harmonica resting in his hand like a memory he refused to let go. He wasn't just surviving. He was still keeping a promise. And Keanu was starting to understand that keeping it wasn't about grand reunions or big revelation. It was about showing up, over and over, until the music found its way home. On Tuesday, near the end of winter, the subway station was colder than usual, the air sharp with the scent of metal and damp concrete. Keanu arrived a little earlier than normal, carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag from a nearby bakery. Frank was already there, seated in his usual spot, beneath the flickering light, his breath visible in the chill. Keanu sat beside him without a word, handing him the warm bag. Frank opened it slowly, the corners of his mouth twitching upward when he saw the steaming pastry inside. "You're gonna spoil me," he said, but there was no real protest in his voice. Keanu shrugged with a small smile. "Maybe you deserve it." Frank chuckled, a low rumble deep in his chest. They sat in silence for a while, sipping coffee, eating, letting the rhythm of the station settle around them. After a long moment, Frank spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I used to think," he said slowly, "that the worst thing was being forgotten." Keanu glanced over, listening. "But it's not," Frank continued, tapping the harmonica gently against his knee. "The worst thing is forgetting yourself, forgetting you were ever worth saving." Keanu swallowed hard against the lump rising in his throat. Frank turned to look at him, his eyes clearer than Keanu had ever seen them. "You remind me," Frank said simply. "Every Tuesday, you remind me." Keanu didn't know what to say. He didn't know if there were even words big enough for what Frank had just given him. So he just nodded, his throat too tight to speak, and reached out, giving Frank's shoulder a firm, steady squeeze. Frank didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He just sat there, grounded, solid. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu realized Frank wasn't waiting anymore. He wasn't searching the faces rushing past him for someone who might never come. He was living in this moment, right here, right now, with someone who had found him, someone he had already saved without even knowing it. Keanu leaned back against the pillar, feeling the deep, quiet warmth of the connection between them. The subway roared with life around them, but in that small pocket of space, time slowed down. A promise once made, long ago in the smoke and chaos of a wrecked station, had found its way home. And the man who kept showing up with his battered harmonica and weathered hope, he had finally been seen. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, breathing it all in. This wasn't the end. It wasn't even the middle. It was a beginning. A new kind of Tuesday. A new kind of song. One that didn't need an audience. Just 2 souls sitting side by side, carrying each other forward without ever needing to say how. Another Tuesday, another slow morning beneath the concrete sky of the station. Keanu sat beside Frank, the familiar rhythm between them as natural now as breathing. For a long time, they just watched the trains rattle through, people flooding the platforms like waves that never stopped breaking. Then, as the lull settled in again, Frank spoke, his voice softer than usual. "I had a brother once," he said, not looking over. "Danny." Keanu stayed perfectly still, feeling the air tighten around them. Frank rubbed his thumb along the harmonica, tracing the worn metal surface. "We grew up dirt poor," he said. "No place fancy, just the 2 of us against the world, most days." Keanu watched his hands, the way they trembled slightly, but didn't stop moving. "Don't was younger than me, always looking up, always chasing after trouble if I wasn't watching close." A small, broken chuckle escaped him. "Ever. Wanted to be a firefighter, can you believe that? Saving people, pulling them out of the flames." Frank shook his head slowly. "I joined the army to get a salary there. Thought if I made enough, got the GI Bill, I could bring him with me someday, maybe get him into school, get him a real shot." Keanu's chest tightened, each word carving deeper. Frank's fingers tightened on the harmonica. "But I couldn't save him." His voice cracked around the edges, raw. "We got hit outside a village. Ambush, chaos everywhere, smoke, screaming. You can't hear yourself think." He paused, swallowing hard. I turned around and he was just gone. Keanu stared at the grimy tile floor, blinking back the sting in his eyes. "L was 16, Frank whispered. Lied about his age to enlist. Said he couldn't let me go alone." Frank let out a shaking breath, the harmonica rattling slightly against his knee. 16. The number hung in the air like a ghost. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees, giving Frank the space to keep going or not. Frank kept going. After that, I didn't see the point of coming back. I mean, what was left? A handful of medals they handed out like candy to make us forget the bodies? A house full of empty chairs? He shook his head. Died, though. Got a job, wore the tie, played by the rules, even got married. Had a son for a little while. But I couldn't outrun it. Keanu's heart broke a little more with each word. And then, the station. Frank smiled faintly, the saddest smile Keanu had ever seen. "I was sitting down here one night just trying to breathe when it happened." The memory flickered behind Frank's eyes. The crash. He tapped the harmonica once against his boot, a soft, rhythmic beat. Smoke. Screams. Just like before. Frank glanced sideways, his gaze distant. But this time I pulled someone out. His voice thickened. "Boy?" Scared out of his mind. Keanu felt his hands curl into fists in his lap, every muscle in his body straining against the flood of emotion. "I told him he was safe," Frank said, voice breaking. "That someone would come, that he wasn't alone." Frank looked down at the harmonica, the metal glinting under the weak station lights. "And somehow," he said, voice almost a whisper, "I started breathing again, too." Keanu sat very still, the story wrapping itself around him like a thread pulled from some hidden place in his heart. He could see it now. Not just the memory of strong arms pulling him from the smoke, but the heavy weight behind them, the grief, the desperate need to save someone when it had mattered most. Frank had not just saved a boy that night. He had saved himself. And Keanu had been carrying the sound of that harmonica in his chest for years without even knowing why. Frank leaned back against the pillar, exhausted by the telling. "I come back every Tuesday," he said, his voice low. "Always thought maybe he'd remember." He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his bones. But nobody ever did. Just another face in the crowd, I guess. Keanu's chest ached. He wanted so badly to reach out, to tell him, "I remember. I was that boy. I never forgot." But something in Frank's voice, something in the way he spoke, told Keanu that Frank didn't need that revelation yet. Not if it meant reopening wounds that time had just barely managed to scab over. He needed something else first. Not answers. Not apologies. Oh, hope that what he did had mattered. Hope that his promise, made to a frightened little boy in the smoke and chaos, had not been swallowed by the world. Keanu nodded, his throat tight. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. Frank looked at him sideways, his face etched in disbelief. "You think so? I know so." Frank chuckled dryly, shaking his head as if trying to deny the kindness. But something shifted in his posture. Just a fraction, a loosening, a tiny sliver of weight lifting off shoulders that had carried too much for too long. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped item he had been carrying for days without quite knowing when he would give it. He placed it on the bench between them. Frank eyed it warily. "What's this?" Keanu smiled. "Something to keep the music going." Frank unwrapped it slowly, rough fingers careful on the delicate paper. Inside was a small harmonica case. Brand new, deep blue velvet, stitched along the sides. Frank opened it with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. Inside was a harmonica, shiny, untouched, waiting. Frank stared at it for a long time, swallowing hard. "I don't deserve this," he said hoarsely. Keanu shook his head. "You deserve everything." Frank lifted the new harmonica to his lips and played a single, trembling note. The sound floated up into the rafters of the subway station, sweet and broken and full of all the things words could never say. Keanu closed his eyes, letting the music wrap around him, letting it stitch together all the silent places between them, letting it heal what had been waiting to heal for 25 long years. And somewhere deep inside, Keanu knew this was not the end of Frank's story. It was the beginning of a song that had waited decades to be heard. And it was only just beginning. The next morning, Keanu called Sophia. He stood by the window of his apartment, the early sun casting long shadows across the floor, his voice low but urgent. "I need your help," he said. Sophia, as always, didn't ask for details. She just said, "Tell me what you need." By noon, they were working quietly behind the scenes. No headlines, no cameras, no attention. Just a quiet mission to give Frank something he hadn't had in decades, a place to belong. Sophia tapped into her network, reaching out to a foundation that specialized in helping homeless veterans transition into safe, stable housing. The director, an old friend of hers, promised to pull some strings. "She won't have to stay in the shelter," Sophia assured Keanu. "We'll find him a small place, somewhere with dignity." That word stuck in Keanu's mind. Agony. That's what Frank deserved. Not charity. It's not pity. A hand held out, not a handout thrown down. They found an available studio apartment not far from the subway station. Small but clean, with a kitchen that needed a little love, and a window that overlooked a quiet alley filled with flowers. It wasn't grand. It was human. Keanu also arranged something else. Through another friend, he found a music therapy program designed specifically for veterans dealing with PTSD and loss. Group sessions, private lessons, quiet spaces where music could speak when words failed. It was everything Frank had been carrying alone for too long. But convincing Frank? That would be the real work. That Tuesday, Keanu showed up at the station, as always, 2 coffees in hand, the new harmonica case tucked carefully in his jacket pocket. Frank sat waiting, the familiar sight bringing a rush of warmth to Keanu's chest. They shared their coffee in easy silence before Keanu cleared his throat, trying to find the right words. "I've been thinking," Keanu said carefully, "about something that might help." Frank raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. Keanu pulled out a manila folder from his bag and slid it across the bench. "There's a place," he said. "An apartment, not far from here. It's yours if you want it." Frank didn't move, didn't even glance at the folder. Keanu waited. After a long minute, Frank shook his head slowly. "I ain't no charity case," he said, his voice rough. Keanu's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "It's not charity," he said gently. "It's a door, and you deserve to walk through it." Frank stared down at his coffee, shoulders stiff. Keanu pressed on. "There's also a music group," he said. "Other vets, people who get it. No speeches, no therapy talk unless you want it, just music, just breathing." Frank's jaw clenched. Keanu could see the war happening inside him. The pride, the shame, the exhaustion, the fear. "I'm not trying to fix you," Keanu said quietly. "You're not broken." Frank let out a sharp, shaky breath. "You don't owe me nothing, son," he said. Keanu smiled. "Maybe not," he said. "But maybe I'm just trying to pay forward what you gave me." For a long, aching moment, Frank said nothing. Then, slowly, he reached out and rested his hand on top of the folder. A silent agreement. A beginning. It took a few more Tuesdays. Not because Frank didn't want the help, but because accepting it meant facing all the years he had spent convincing himself he didn't deserve better. Each week, Keanu showed up. Sometimes with coffee. Sometimes with nothing but time. He didn't push. He didn't lecture. He just sat and listened, and let Frank know that whatever choice he made would be respected. It was that steady patience, more than anything, that wore down the old veteran's resistance. One cold morning, as a biting wind howled through the tunnels, Frank arrived at their bench with something tucked under his arm. a battered duffel bag. The same one he always carried, but today it was zipped up tight, packed like a man ready to move. Without a word, Frank dropped onto the bench beside Keanu and stared straight ahead. "So," he said gruffly, "this place got windows?" Keanu smiled slowly, warmth blooming in his chest. "Yeah," he said, "big ones." Frank grunted. "Good. Hate feeling boxed in." They rose together, Frank slinging the duffel over his shoulder, with surprising strength for a man who had weathered so much. Keanu walked beside him, not leading, not following. Just there. Just present. At the small apartment, Frank hesitated on the threshold. Keanu waited. Finally, Frank stepped inside. The space was modest, but it held a kind of quiet dignity. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the worn wood floors and the simple, clean furniture that Sophia had helped arrange. There was even a battered upright piano tucked into one corner, donated by the Veterans Foundation when they heard about Frank's story. Frank moved slowly through the room, running a hand over the kitchen counter, the back of a chair, the windowsill. He paused longest at the piano. He didn't sit down. He just rested his hand on it, closed his eyes, and breathed. Later that week, Keanu took him to the first music therapy session. Frank resisted all the way there, muttering about group hugs and new age nonsense. But once he stepped into the room and heard the first tentative chords from another vet strumming a guitar, something in his posture softened. The music spoke a language older than pain, older than shame. It spoke in notes that said, "You're not alone. Not anymore." Frank stayed for the full session. Didn't say much. Didn't need to. The harmonica he kept tucked into his jacket said it all. That night, Keanu walked Frank back to his new apartment. As they stood outside the door, Frank turned to him. "Where are you doing all this?" he asked, his voice rough. Keanu thought about it. He thought about smoke and strong hands and the sound of a harmonica played in the dark. Thought about promises made when no one else was looking. "Because someone once saved me, when I didn't even know I needed saving," Keanu said quietly. "And I never forgot." Frank studied him for a long moment, his face shadowed by the porch light. Then he nodded, once, slow and deep. "Guess it's my turn to remember," he said. Keanu smiled. "Welcome home, Frank." And for the first time in 25 years, Frank stepped through a door he could call his own. Later that week, Keanu sat in a small corner of a quiet coffee shop, laptop open, heart full. He thought about everything Frank had carried alone for so long. The years he had spent waiting in the noise of the world, wondering if he had mattered at all. He thought about the boy with the wide eyes, the one Frank had pulled from the smoke and fear, and how that boy had grown up, still hearing the faint echoes of a harmonica in his dreams. He thought about promises, the ones made without ceremony, and the quiet way some heroes walk through the world without ever asking for applause. With slow, deliberate hands, Keanu typed a new post for the Foundation's forum. He didn't use names. He didn't give specifics. He just told the story. A long time ago, he wrote, "A man with a battered harmonica pulled a boy from wreckage and fear. He thought no one noticed. He thought he was forgotten. But heroes don't ask to be remembered. We remember them anyway." At the bottom of the post, he added a simple prompt. "Is there a hero in your life who never knew how much they mattered? Share their story below." He hit publish and waited. It didn't take long. Within minutes, comments began to flood in. A woman wrote about her elementary school janitor who used to leave extra mittens by the lost and found so no child would walk home cold. A man shared about the librarian who let him sit by the heater and read all afternoon when his parents forgot to pick him up. Another person talked about a neighbor who had once paid for their family's groceries without ever mentioning it again. Story after story, small moments woven into lifelines. No parades, no medals, just people holding the world together in invisible ways. Keanu scrolled slowly, absorbing each one. One comment stopped him cold. It read, "Heroes don't ask to be remembered, but we remember them anyway." Beneath it, the commenter had written a few more lines. "My grandfather fought in a war no one wanted to talk about. He came home broken, but he still found time to build me a swing from an old tree in the backyard. I was too young to understand then. But now, I swing my daughter on that same tree, and every time, I remember him." Keanu stared at the words, a lump forming in his throat. This was why he had started the foundation. This was why he sat on cold benches and listened to broken men tell their stories. Not to save anyone, but to honor the ones who had saved without ever knowing it. To stitch the quiet heroics of the world back into something whole again. He closed his laptop carefully, the sound of the hinge clicking shut echoing in the quiet shop. Outside, the city kept moving. The world kept rushing. But somewhere a thread had been tied. A song had been heard. And a man with a harmonica was no longer forgotten. The next morning, Keanu returned to the forum to find the number of replies had doubled overnight. Stories kept pouring in. One person wrote about a childhood crossing guard who used to tell jokes every day, not knowing that the small bursts of laughter kept them going through a dark home life. Another shared about a nurse who stayed past her shift to sit with them through a terrifying diagnosis. There were stories of teachers who noticed sadness behind a smile, of bus drivers who kept extra snacks for kids who forgot lunch, of strangers who stayed beside accident victims just so they wouldn't be alone. The comment section didn't feel like a comment section anymore. It felt like a living, breathing memory quilt, stitched from 1,000 moments of unseen bravery. Keanu smiled to himself as he scrolled, heart heavier and lighter at the same time. Then he saw another comment. X. This one simply read, "I once got lost at a fair when I was 6. A man in a faded army jacket found me crying by a hot dog stand. He knelt down, gave me his harmonica, and told me to play it loud so my parents could find me. I never got his name, but I still have the harmonica." Keanu leaned back in his chair, blinking hard. Different person, different place, different story, but the same theme. The same quiet kind of heroism Frank carried with him every Tuesday at the station. A kind of goodness that asked for nothing in return. A kind of goodness the world rushed past every day without noticing. Keanu thought about the way Frank always sat a little apart from the crowds. Not angry, not bitter, just waiting to matter again, waiting to be remembered. He knew now, without a doubt, that helping Frank wasn't about charity or rescue. It was about reflection, about giving back a mirror to someone who had spent his life giving everything and asking for nothing. It was about letting Frank see, with his own tired eyes, that he had been a part of something bigger, a part of countless lives, even if he never knew their names, even if they never knew his. Keanu drafted another post, his fingers moving slowly over the keys. "To the heroes who thought they were invisible," he wrote, "thank you. Your kindness, your courage, your music, it stayed with us. It became part of who we are. You were not forgotten." He ended the post simply, "If you're still waiting for someone to find you, know this. They're looking, maybe not with their eyes, but with their hearts." When he pressed send, he sat there a long time, not reading the response, not needing to, because somewhere Frank was waking up in a room full of sunlight, and somewhere deep in that city noise a battered harmonica waited for another song to be played. Not forgotten, not invisible, just waiting for the right note, the one that would tell him he was never truly lost. It was a rainy Thursday when Keanu decided it was time, not for a speech, not for some grand moment, but for something smaller. I've never seen a cop. He pulled up the contact list Sophia had sent him weeks ago and dialed a number listed simply as Ramon, Instrument Restorations. The voice that answered was deep, weathered, and kind. "You've got something old that needs saving," Ramon said without preamble. "Or something lost you want brought back?" Keanu smiled softly. "Both," he said. The workshop was tucked away down a narrow street, hidden between a bakery and a shoe repair shop that smelled of leather and cinnamon. Inside, it smelled of sawdust, metal polish, and history. Ramon was a broad-shouldered man with silver hair pulled into a low braid. His hands were stained from years of coaxing life back into forgotten instruments. Keanu explained the situation carefully, choosing his words with care. He showed Ramon a photo of an old Marine band harmonica. "The model Frank used to carry. It needs to be just like this," Keanu said. "Not new, not shiny, like it's lived a life, like it's waited." Ramon listened, nodding thoughtfully. Then he said something that caught Keanu off guard. "Instruments remember, you know," Ramon said. "You treat them right, they hold the songs inside, all the heartbreak, all the hope." Keanu nodded, feeling the truth of it in his bones. They selected a harmonica from Ramon's collection, one with a few small dings in the metal, a patina of time that couldn't be faked. Ramon promised he would clean it, tune it, and most importantly, keep its soul intact. Before Keanu left, he hesitated at the door. "One more thing," he said, voice low. "Inside the case, could you carve a message?" Ramon smiled. "Of course. What do you want it to say?" Keanu thought for a long moment before answering. Then he said it, steady and sure. "Thank you for saving me." Ramon's eyes softened. "No charge for that part," he said. The next few days stretched long. Keanu visited Frank as usual, never hinting at the plan. Frank seemed lighter somehow, less like a man weighed down by ghosts, and more like someone slowly remembering he was still alive. They talked about little things, the weather, the way the pigeons always fought over the same crumb near the ticket booth, the latest kid who tried to busk at the wrong hour and got chased off by a grumpy station manager. Frank laughed more easily now. He played softer songs on his new harmonica, songs that lilted through the tunnels like whispers of things long hoped for. And all the while, Keanu carried the secret inside him, like a flame cupped against the wind, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the day when a battered man would open a velvet case, read a simple message, and finally see himself the way the world had seen him all along. As a hero, the harmonica was ready by the next Tuesday. Ramon handed it to Keanu in a deep burgundy velvet case, the kind that whispered of care every time the latch clicked open. Inside, the harmonica gleamed, not with the shine of something new, but with the quiet luster of something loved. Keanu opened the case carefully. Nestled beneath the instrument, carved into a thin brass plate, were the words he had asked for. "Thank you for saving me." He closed the lid gently, heart pounding. He knew Frank wouldn't expect it, wouldn't know how to react, but that was the point. Some gifts weren't meant to be earned. Some were simply meant to be given. Keanu made his way to the subway station early, the velvet case tucked securely under his jacket. The platform was unusually quiet that morning. The early commuters had already rushed by, their lives pulling them toward offices, deadlines, and destinations. Frank sat in his usual spot, harmonica in hand, tapping out a lazy, wandering melody that floated through the empty space like sunlight drifting through water. Keanu watched him for a moment before approaching. "Morning," Keanu said, sliding onto the bench beside him. Frank tipped his head in greeting but didn't stop playing. Keanu waited. When Frank finally set the old harmonica on his knee, Keanu pulled the velvet case from inside his jacket and placed it silently between them. Frank stared at it. Suspicion flickered across his face. "What's this?" he asked gruffly. Keanu just shrugged, giving a small, almost boyish smile. "Open it." Frank hesitated. Then, with a trembling hand, he flipped the latch and lifted the lid. For a moment, he said nothing. Just stared. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed over the smooth metal of the harmonica like it was something too sacred to touch. Finally, he lifted it out. Frank held it up to the dim light. He turned it slowly in his hand, reading the inscription. Frank's breath caught. His shoulders stiffened. He blinked rapidly, fighting something back that didn't want to stay buried. He closed the case slowly and set it carefully on the bench between them. Then he looked at Keanu, really looked at him. "You?" he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're..." Keanu nodded once, his throat too tight for words. Frank turned his face away, rubbing a hand roughly across his eyes. The harmonica gleamed softly in his hand. When he finally spoke, it was barely louder than the humming of the tracks beneath them. "Well, I thought I lost him." Keanu shook his head. "You saved him," he said. "You saved me." Frank's chest hitched with a deep, broken sound. For a long time, they sat there. Two men linked by a moment neither fully remembered, but neither had ever forgotten. No more words were needed. The music had already said it all. Frank sat there, the new harmonica resting in his hands like something fragile, something too precious to close his fingers around just yet. He looked down at the inscription again, his thumb brushing the words as if trying to feel their weight. A low, shaky laugh slipped from his throat. "I never thought..." he started, but the words fell apart. Keanu didn't rush him, hazy where he didn't fill the space. He just waited, as Frank had once waited for a boy to find his way back to the station. Finally, Frank lifted the harmonica to his lips. The first note was hesitant, wobbly from emotion. The second was stronger. The third stretched into a long, aching sound that seemed to fill every crack in the old subway walls. Keanu closed his eyes. He remembered it now. Not in fragments, not like a dream, but clear. The crash, the smoke, the strong arms lifting him out. And then, sitting on a cracked bench, a man with a battered harmonica playing a tune that somehow told a terrified boy that he was safe, that he had been found. That memory wrapped itself around this moment, binding past and present together like a song played in perfect harmony. When Frank finished, he lowered the harmonica and looked at Keanu, his eyes clearer than Keanu had ever seen them. "You came back," Frank said. "I never really left," Keanu answered softly. Frank gave a shaky chuckle and looked around the station. The same worn tiles, the same peeling paint, but somehow everything different now. He shook his head, smiling through the dampness in his eyes. "I ain't got much left," he said. "But whatever's left, it's yours, kid." Keanu smiled. "It's all I ever needed." Frank tucked the harmonica carefully back into the velvet case, snapping it shut with a decisive click. He placed it gently inside his duffel bag, like a man placing a treasure where it would be safe. Then he leaned back against the bench, stretched his legs out, and let out a long, slow breath. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for someone who might never come. He wasn't carrying the weight of a broken promise. He wasn't invisible. He was sane. He was remembered. And he was finally home. Keanu stayed beside him for a long time, not talking, not needing to. The trains came and went. The crowd ebbed and flowed. But at that old bench, time stood still. Two lives, once thrown together by chaos, now stitched back together by a single song. And somewhere deep in the subway tunnels, the faint, lingering notes of a harmonica whispered a new story, one not of loss, but of return. The following Tuesday, Keanu arrived at the subway station early, the harmonica tucked securely in his jacket pocket. He could feel it there, heavy and light, all at once. The velvet case was worn now, from being opened and closed so many times in his hands over the past few days, each time like a promise being made all over again. Frank was already sitting on the bench when Keanu approached, his duffel bag resting at his feet, his old harmonica tucked into one hand like always. He looked up as Keanu sat down beside him. "Morning," Martha grunted, offering a small nod. Keanu smiled but said nothing. Instead, he pulled the velvet case from his jacket. Frank's eyes narrowed in confusion. "You bringing gifts again, hotshot?" Keanu chuckled under his breath and shook his head. "Not this time," he said. He flipped open the latch and lifted the harmonica free. Without a word, he raised it to his lips and played. The melody was slow, deliberate. Soft notes stretched through the cool, dusty air of the station, curling around the pillars, weaving between the empty benches, touching the cracked tiles underfoot. It wasn't a song Frank had heard in a long time, but it was a song he had once played with shaking hands on a night filled with smoke and sirens and the sharp sting of fear. The very night he had lifted a terrified boy out of chaos and into safety. The boy he had soothed with music when words would have only made the terror worse. Frank's entire body went still. His hands, which were always in motion, tapping, fidgeting, keeping rhythm against his knees, froze mid-drum. His eyes widened, locked onto Keanu. The notes floated between them, stitching across the years. Keanu finished the melody and lowered the harmonica to his lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Frank's breath hitched. His fingers curled tightly into the fabric of his jacket, knuckles white with strain. He opened his mouth once, closed it, tried again. "You," he rasped, voice raw. "It's you." Keanu nodded once, silently. Frank's face crumpled in slow motion. A tear broke free and slid down the weathered lines of his cheek. He didn't brush it away, didn't hide it. He just sat there, staring at Keanu, like a man watching a ghost turn back into flesh. I thought you were just a dream," Frank whispered, voice shaking. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the harmonica still warm in his hands. "You weren't a dream," he said softly. "You were the reason I made it." Another tear followed the first. Frank blinked hard, trying to steady himself, but the memories were crashing down on him faster than he could catch them. The smoke, the sound of sirens, the child clinging to him with trembling fingers, and the song he had played in the dark, hoping, praying, that the boy would feel safe enough to breathe again. Now that boy was sitting beside him, Ahmed, alive, and he remembered. Frank leaned back against the bench, as if the realization had knocked the air out of him. His hand pressed over his heart, not from pain, but from something heavier, something deeper. I thought I lost everything that night," he said hoarsely. "But I didn't, did I?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "You saved something." Frank let out a long, shuddering breath. He stared at the harmonica in Keanu's hands, the polished metal gleaming dully under the station lights. Then he looked back at Keanu, taking in the man he had unknowingly watched grow up from afar, the boy he had believed he would never see again. Frank's voice cracked when he spoke again. "You remembered the song?" Keanu smiled softly. "I didn't know what it was for a long time," he said. "It was just a sound I carried, a feeling, safety, when everything else was chaos." Frank closed his eyes, and for a moment he seemed to slip away, back into that smoky, broken night. He whispered, almost to himself, "I played it because I didn't know what else to do." "You did enough," Keanu said quietly. Frank opened his eyes again. Tears glistened there, but he didn't look broken anymore. He looked more whole than Keanu had ever seen him. "You stayed alive," Frank said after a long pause. "You made something of yourself." Keanu smiled wider, shaking his head slightly. "Because someone found me when I needed it most." Frank looked down at his weathered hands, as if seeing them anew. Hands that had once pulled a scared child from wreckage. Hands that had shaken when he played a song for a boy he thought he had failed. Hands that had never stopped coming back to this station, week after week, hoping against hope. Keanu lifted the harmonica once more, pressing it gently into Frank's hands. "You deserve to play it again," he said. Frank swallowed hard. The harmonica felt almost too heavy to lift, but somehow he found the strength. He brought it to his lips, hesitating just a beat. Then he played. The melody came out rough, cracked at first, but it was there. That same tune. That same promise. Keanu closed his eyes, letting it wash over him. The sound filled the empty station, filling all the spaces time had hollowed out between them. When Frank finished, he lowered the harmonica and looked at Keanu with a watery smile. "You remember it better than I do," he said, voice thick with emotion. Keanu chuckled softly. "I remember what mattered." They sat there for a long time, the harmonica resting between them, a bridge built out of sound and memory. And for the first time since that long-ago night, neither of them felt lost anymore. They had found their way back. Together. Frank cradled the harmonica gently between his palms, as if it might vanish if he let go. The subway station buzzed faintly with the life of the city above, but for Frank and Keanu, the world had narrowed to this one bench, this one moment. "You know," Frank said after a while, his voice rasping from emotion and years of silence, "I spent a long time thinking I didn't save anyone." He stared at the instrument. That maybe all I did was buy a few extra minutes for a scared kid, nothing more. Keanu turned to him, steady and sure. "You gave me more than minutes," he said quietly. "You gave me a lifetime." Frank squeezed his eyes shut for a second, the weight of those words sinking deep. "I didn't know how to fix it," he whispered. "Didn't know how to fix anything after the war. But that day, pulling you out, sitting there, playing, it was the first time I didn't feel like a ghost." Keanu's throat tightened. "You weren't a ghost," he said. "You were the only real thing in a world that didn't make sense." Frank looked at him, and a slow, trembling smile crossed his weathered face. For the first time in a long, long while, he allowed himself to believe it. Keanu shifted slightly, pulling something else from his jacket pocket. It was a small, folded piece of paper. Frank took it, unfolding it carefully with shaking hands. Inside was a copy of the application Keanu and Sophia had helped file, a housing voucher approval from the Veterans Foundation. Frank blinked at it, not quite understanding at first. "You've got a place now," Keanu said softly. "Warm bed, safe roof, no more cold benches." Frank ran a finger down the paper as if tracing a miracle. "Why?" he whispered. "Why would you go through all this for me?" Keanu smiled, a little broken, a little healed. "Because once you sat down next to a scared kid when everyone else walked by." Frank's jaw trembled. He clutched the paper to his chest, then reached for the harmonica again, as if grounding himself between the two gifts. Keanu stood slowly, the motion unhurried, respectful. He reached out a hand. Frank hesitated, then took it. Their grip was firm, steady, filled with everything words could never cover. "Come on, Frank," Keanu said with a small smile. "Let's go home." Frank stared at him, disbelief warring with hope. Then he pushed himself up from the bench, his knees cracking in protest, but his spirit lifting. The harmonica stayed gripped tightly in his hand. As they walked toward the exit side by side, Frank gave one last look over his shoulder at the bench where he had waited for so many years. The bench where he had lost hope and found it again. And as they stepped into the soft gray light of the city morning, Frank tucked the harmonica into his jacket. The music would come with him. The memories, too. But for the first time in a lifetime, he wasn't carrying it alone. The city hummed quietly outside the subway station as Frank and Keanu made their way toward the exit. Neither of them spoke much. There were too many words that could be said, and none of them seemed big enough to cover what hung between them. Instead, they walked in silence, shoulder to shoulder. The cool morning air hit them as they climbed the cracked stairs to the street. Frank paused at the top, breathing it in. For so long, he had watched the world from the shadows of that station, convinced he didn't belong out here anymore. But today felt different. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't forgotten. He was part of something again. Keanu gestured toward a small cafe on the corner, a quiet place with chipped paint on the windows and the smell of fresh coffee drifting into the street. Frank nodded once, and they crossed the sidewalk together. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A tired-looking waitress smiled at them and pointed toward a booth near the window. Frank slid into the seat, his duffel bag tucked close beside him like a loyal companion. Keanu sat across from him, folding his hands loosely on the table. Still, no rush, no demands, just presence. The waitress brought 2 coffees without asking. Frank wrapped his hands around the cup like it was a lifeline. He stared into the dark liquid for a long time before finally speaking. "You know," he said, his voice low and rough, "I used to sit at that station every Tuesday, thinking maybe it didn't matter if I showed up anymore." Keanu listened, his gaze steady. Frank's fingers tapped slowly against the ceramic mug. "But I went anyway, week after week, even when it hurt to hope." His mouth twitched into a half-smile. It felt like maybe if I kept showing up, the world might remember me. He lifted his gaze and met Keanu's eyes. "And it did," he said softly. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "It never forgot you, Frank," he said. Frank let out a shaky breath and nodded, the motion small but sure. For a few minutes they just sat there, sipping coffee, letting the weight of 25 years settle between them. Not like a burden, but like an old familiar coat finally set down. The light from the window spilled across the table, catching the silver of Frank's hair and the faint scuff marks on Keanu's jacket. It caught the harmonica too, peeking out from the top of Frank's duffel bag. A quiet reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything that had been found. Frank cleared his throat once, rough with emotion he didn't know how to say out loud. "You made it," he whispered. Keanu smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep inside. "Because of you," he said. Frank blinked hard, the simple truth hitting him harder than any speech ever could. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. The coffee between them cooled slowly as the moments stretched on, but neither seemed to notice. Sometimes healing didn't need fanfare or grand gestures. Sometimes it looked like 2 people sitting quietly, letting their hearts speak in ways their mouths couldn't. Keanu glanced down at the harmonica poking out of Frank's duffel. "You still got music left in you," he said softly. Frank gave a low chuckle, the sound rough but real. "Maybe a few notes," he said. Keanu smiled. "I think the world still needs to hear them." Frank shook his head, not dismissing the idea but weighing it. "I used to think music was something I lost," he said, "like everything else." He looked up at Keanu, his gaze steady but softer now. "But maybe it's something I carried without even knowing." Keanu nodded. "You didn't lose it, Frank. You gave it away when it mattered most." Frank swallowed thickly. He let the silence settle again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full. The kind of silence that only came after a storm had passed and the sky remembered how to breathe. The waitress came by to refill their cups, her smile warm but unobtrusive. Frank wrapped his hands around the fresh cup, grounding himself. "You know," he said after a long pause, "I always wondered if the kid I pulled out of that wreck even made it." He laughed once, short and dry. "Sometimes I thought maybe it was better not to know, in case it didn't end well." Keanu leaned forward. "I did." Frank's eyes grew misty again. "You're proof of that?" Keanu nodded. "And so are you." Frank smiled, small and genuine. It transformed his entire face, peeling away years of loneliness in a single moment. "I spent so long thinking I failed," Frank whispered. Keanu shook his head. "You didn't." Frank reached into his jacket and pulled out the new harmonica Keanu had given him. He turned it over in his hands, tracing the tiny inscription inside with a trembling finger. "Thank you for saving me," it said. He closed his fist around it tightly, holding it close to his chest. "You don't owe me anything," he said. Keanu's voice was steady. "I know." "But you're here anyway," Frank said. Keanu smiled. "Yeah," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." Frank exhaled slowly, the tension leaving his body, one breath at a time. It was strange how heavy things became lighter when you stopped carrying them alone. For the first time in decades, Frank believed it might be okay to stop waiting for redemption and start living it. He glanced at Keanu again, a new kind of gratitude shining through the weariness in his eyes. "Guess it's never too late to come home," Frank said quietly. Keanu nodded. "Never." The harmonica gleamed faintly between them. The promise made. The promise kept. The afternoon sun shifted higher, casting a soft glow through the dusty windows of the small cafe. Outside, the city buzzed and moved as it always had, unaware of the quiet miracle happening at a corner booth. Frank set the harmonica gently on the table, his fingers resting beside it. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, almost like he was speaking to the world beyond Keanu. "I thought promises died when people did," Frank said. "When I lost him, I figured everything good I promised to be died too." He looked down, studying the faint scratches on the table. "But maybe promises are like songs," he said, almost to himself. "Maybe even when you can't hear them anymore, they're still playing somewhere." Keanu's chest tightened at the raw truth in those words. He nodded once. "The meat don't disappear," Keanu said. "They just wait." Frank's mouth pulled into a smile, sad but whole. "And sometimes," he added, "they find their way back." They sat for a while longer, sipping coffee and letting that truth soak in. Frank shifted in his seat, easing his old joints. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I don't have much, but what I do have, it's yours. Always." Keanu shook his head, a soft smile touching his lips. "You already gave it to me a long time ago." Frank's eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. There was no shame in those tears anymore. Only gratitude. Only grace. The waitress dropped the check off quietly, sliding it onto the edge of the table. Keanu slipped a few bills under it without a second thought. It wasn't about payment. It was about honoring the small, sacred space they had created. As they rose to leave, Frank tucked the harmonica safely into his coat pocket. He patted it once, like a talisman, like a piece of home he was finally allowed to carry openly. Keanu opened the door, holding it for Frank as they stepped back into the city. The streets bustled around them. Cars honked. People hurried past with bags and coffee cups and cell phones glued to their ears. But Keanu and Frank moved slowly, deliberately, through it all. Not out of weakness, out of reverence, out of the knowledge that some journeys were too important to rush. At the edge of the block, Frank stopped and turned to Keanu. "You sure about this?" he asked gruffly, a flicker of old fear in his voice. Keanu smiled and nodded. "I'm sure." Frank took a deep breath and nodded back. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe he didn't have to walk alone. Together they crossed the street, step by step, toward whatever was waiting next, not looking back. Not anymore. And somewhere deep in Frank's jacket, the harmonica sat warm against his heart. Silent for now, but ready, whenever he was. The first thing Frank noticed when he opened the door to his new apartment was the light. It wasn't fancy, far from it. The walls were plain, the furniture secondhand, the floors creaked when you walked across them. But the sunlight spilled in through the wide windows, warm and golden, touching everything like a quiet blessing. Frank stood in the doorway for a long time, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, harmonica tucked safely into his coat. Keanu stepped in behind him, carrying a small cardboard box filled with donated kitchen supplies. Frank turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. "It's yours now," Keanu said, voice low and steady. Frank blinked rapidly, overwhelmed. "I don't even know where to start," he said. Keanu grinned. "How about the music corner?" Frank chuckled, a real chuckle this time, and nodded. Together, they set it up in the sunniest part of the living room. A battered but solid little table. A second-hand stereo Sophia had tracked down. A stack of old jazz and blues CDs. And right in the center, on a polished wooden stand, they placed the harmonica. Frank touched the stand gently, like he was afraid it might be a dream. "It's been a long time since I had a place that felt like mine," he said. Keanu leaned back against the wall, arms crossed. "You earned it." Frank shook his head slowly. I don't know about that. Keanu pushed off the wall, walking over. You showed up, he said simply. Even when no one else did. Even when you thought it didn't matter. He pointed to the harmonica. The matters. Frank swallowed hard. He didn't know how to explain it, the way hope felt like something strange and heavy in his chest after so many years without it. Instead, he just nodded. He ran a thumb over the smooth surface of the harmonica. It shone faintly in the sunlight. I guess it's time to start making noise again, Frank said with a small smile. Keanu laughed. They were coming for you. Frank laughed too, a real, full sound that startled even himself. The apartment didn't have much, but it had windows. It had sunlight. It had music. And it had the beginning of something Frank had given up on a long time ago. The two hung. He sat down slowly on the worn couch, harmonica in hand. Keanu dropped onto the armchair across from him. For a moment, they just sat, soaking it in. Frank lifted the harmonica to his lips and played a few soft notes. They wavered at first, uncertain, but then they steadied, clear and sure. And the room, modest and cracked as it was, filled with music. Not perfect, not polished. It was full of second chances, full of grace, full of life. Over the next few weeks, Frank found a new rhythm. It wasn't the kind he once knew, the high-tempo rush of surviving from one moment to the next. It was slower, steadier, like the soft beat of a heart finally remembering how to trust itself. Each morning, Frank would sit by the window with a cup of black coffee, letting the sunlight warm his tired bones. The harmonica sat nearby on its wooden stand, a quiet reminder that he had a place in this world. One afternoon, Keanu stopped by with Sophia, carrying a folder of information. You ready for the next step? Keanu asked, smiling gently. Frank raised an eyebrow. I'm almost afraid to ask. Sophia chuckled. Nothing too crazy, she said. We found a local veterans center that's looking for a music therapy volunteer. Frank's mouth opened, then closed again. A volunteer. Not charity. Not pity. A place where he could give something back. He stared down at the flyer Keanu handed him. The words blurred a little, but he could make them out. Music therapy for veterans, healing through sound. Frank rubbed his thumb over the paper. You really think anyone wants to hear an old man wheeze into a harmonica? He joked. But there was a tremor of hope beneath the words. Keanu didn't laugh. He just looked Frank straight in the eye. I think they need you more than you know. Frank sat back in his chair, the flyer resting on his knee. A long moment passed. Finally, he nodded. I'll go, he said. Keanu smiled. Sophia beamed. And just like that, a door opened. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a standing ovation. It was one man, battered but standing, choosing to give what he had. The first music therapy session was small. 4 veterans, a few folding chairs, and a scratched-up guitar someone had donated years ago. Frank stood at the front of the room, his palms sweating. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure if his story mattered. But when he pulled out his harmonica and played a slow, aching tune, the room changed. The men and women sitting there didn't need fancy words. They needed honesty. They needed the sound of survival, of loss, of hope, stitched together through broken notes. When he finished, no one clapped. They just sat there, breathing, letting the music fill the spaces inside them that words had never quite reached. One younger veteran, barely out of his 20s, wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. Play another, he said hoarsely. Frank smiled. He lifted the harmonica again, and he played. Not to impress, not to perform, but to heal. For them, for himself, for every promise that had been made and kept, even when no one else remembered. The music filled the cracked walls and broken hearts and dusty corners of that old room. And for the first time in years, Frank felt whole. He wasn't lost anymore. He was home. The weeks turned into months, and Frank's life began to bloom in ways he never expected. Every Tuesday afternoon, after his sessions at the Veterans Center, Frank would walk back to his small apartment, harmonica case tucked safely under his arm, a little more sure of his steps each time. Neighbors began to recognize him, the man who played music in the evenings when the hallways were too quiet. Children would sometimes stop outside his door, giggling when they heard the low, playful notes floating through the air. Frank started leaving his door open during the day, letting the music drift freely. He wasn't hiding anymore. One evening, Keanu stopped by again. This time, he carried a new gift, a small recording device. "I thought you might want to record some of your songs," Keanu said. Frank chuckled, rubbing his hand over the stubble on his chin. "You trying to turn me into some kind of rock star?" Keanu smiled. "Just giving the world a way to keep hearing you, even when you're not there?" Frank turned the device over in his hands, feeling the unexpected weight of it. "You really think anyone would listen?" he asked, half teasing, half fearful. Keanu's answer was simple. "The mayor today already are." Later that night, Frank sat alone in his apartment, the recorder blinking softly on the table. He picked up his harmonica and thought about all the years he spent believing his music didn't matter. He thought about the subway station, the boy, the promise, and the way life had somehow folded itself into a song he was still learning to play. He lifted the harmonica to his lips and began to record. Slow, aching notes at first, then lighter ones, dancing, like the laughter he thought he had forgotten. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was his. Across town, Keanu sat at home, thinking about the strange and beautiful way the world worked. How a single moment, a man with a harmonica pulling a boy from the wreckage, could ripple across decades, unseen, but never lost. He smiled to himself, grateful, not just for Frank, but for every invisible kindness that stitched the world back together, one quiet thread at a time. The next morning, Frank walked into the Veterans Center carrying the recorder. He played a short clip for the group, a song without a title, just raw feeling. When it ended, the room was silent for a long moment. Then the younger vet, the one who never spoke much, wiped at his eyes and said, "That's what it sounds like, to come home." Frank didn't say anything. He just nodded, because he knew. He knew exactly what it sounded like. And now, finally, he knew it was a song he was allowed to keep playing. The subway station hadn't changed much over the years. The same chipped tiles, the same heavy air, scented with metal, concrete, and memory. But today, something new had been added. A small plaque, polished to a soft gleam, mounted carefully on the back of the old wooden bench where Frank had once sat for so many lonely Tuesdays. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't grand. It was just a simple inscription, etched deeply into the metal. To those who save lives without knowing it, and to the songs that never leave us. Frank stood a few paces away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, staring at the plaque. Keanu stood beside him in silence, giving him the space he needed. A few early morning commuters drifted past without noticing, but others slowed, drawn in by the sight of something new in a place that rarely changed. Frank took a slow breath. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe some overwhelming flood of emotion. Maybe guilt. Maybe regret. But what he felt instead was something he barely recognized. Pride. Quiet, steady pride. Not in himself, exactly, but in the life he had touched without even knowing. A small girl in a bright pink jacket stopped in front of the bench, her hand in her mother's. She pointed at the plaque. "Mommy, what does it say?" Her mother bent down and read it aloud, her voice soft but strong. The little girl smiled and nodded like she understood something bigger than words. Then she pulled a crumpled drawing from her backpack, a crooked rainbow sketched in crayon, and tucked it carefully under the edge of the bench. Frank's throat tightened. More people started noticing. A man in a business suit slipped a folded sticky note between the bench slats. An elderly woman in a floral scarf left a small white flower. Someone else placed a dog-eared photo of a young soldier in uniform. Each offering was quiet. Each one said in its own way, "I remember. I'm grateful. I believe." Frank turned to Keanu, his voice rough. "Did you?" Keanu shook his head. "Only suggested the plaque," he said. He smiled. "The rest is theirs." Frank let out a shaky laugh. "I don't deserve all this." Keanu's smile faded into something more serious. "You deserve to know the truth," he said. "You mattered." The two men stood there for a long time, watching as the bench transformed from an ordinary subway seat into something sacred, a place for promises kept and lives touched, a small corner of the world where hope lived on, quietly and stubbornly, like a melody that refused to fade. Frank finally stepped forward. He placed his hand gently on the plaque, tracing the words with a calloused finger. His harmonica sat warm in his pocket. He didn't need to play it right now. The music was already here, in the footsteps that slowed, in the smiles exchanged between strangers, in the silent thanks tucked into the cracks of a worn wooden bench. Music without sound, gratitude without language, promise without end. The next morning, more notes appeared. Scraps of notebook paper, torn edges fluttering in the draft of passing trains. Some were anonymous. Some were signed only with first names. "Thank you for showing me kindness when I thought I didn't deserve it. You gave me hope the day I needed it most. I don't know who you are, but your music stayed with me." The bench had become more than wood and bolts. It had become a living memory, a vessel for the invisible threads connecting broken people to each other across time. Frank visited it often, sometimes just passing by after his music sessions, other times sitting for an hour with his hands folded in his lap, reading the new messages people left. He never took any of the notes. He just sat quietly and let them be. Each one a testimony. Each one a reminder. One afternoon, a teenager in a battered hoodie sat down beside him. Neither spoke at first. Then the boy pulled a harmonica from his backpack, scuffed and missing a cover plate, but still capable of holding music. He looked at Frank with uncertain eyes. "Can you teach me?" he asked. Frank felt something crack open inside his chest. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, kid," he said, voice thick. "I can teach you." They spent the next hour trading notes, clumsy at first, then smoother. Other passengers glanced over, a few smiles tugging at tired faces. The old man with the harmonica was still making music, still saving people, and one broken note at a time. That night, Frank found a new addition tucked beneath the bench, a small card printed with neat handwriting. It read, "For every song that caught a falling soul, for every silent hero who never asked for thanks, we see you. We remember." Frank folded the card carefully and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket next to the harmonica. It felt right there, like it belonged. As winter approached, Keanu returned to the bench with Frank one chilly evening, both of them wrapped in heavy coats, scarves tucked up against the biting wind. Frank pulled out the harmonica and played a slow tune, the breathy notes curling like smoke into the cold air. Keanu closed his eyes and listened. No words were needed between them anymore. Everything important had already been said, and everything else was written in the music, in the quiet acts of remembrance, in the stubborn refusal to let hope die in forgotten places. When Frank finished, Keanu clapped him on the back and grinned. "Still got it?" he said. Frank chuckled, tucking the harmonica away. "Was never about being good," he said, "just about being there." Keanu nodded, his throat tight. He understood. He always had. Together they stood by the bench a little longer, letting the city move around them, letting the music linger unseen. And, somewhere deep beneath the tracks, the song continued. Alive, lighting, promising. The gathering was small, held inside a sun-warmed hall not far from the Veterans Center. Rows of folding chairs filled the space, some occupied by men and women who carried old wounds quietly on their backs and in their eyes. There were no speeches that day. No ceremony, only music. Frank sat near the front, harmonica resting loosely in his weathered hands. The same harmonica Keanu had placed into that velvet case not so long ago. Keanu sat in the back, watching, his heart hammering in his chest in a way he couldn't quite explain. Frank looked older under the harsh indoor lights. Not frail, just real, human, in a way that stripped away all the invisible armor he had worn for decades. When the room settled into a gentle hush, Frank stood up. No introduction, no apology. Song. He just brought the harmonica to his lips and began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, like a memory unfolding. Then the melody grew, still gentle, but sure. It wasn't a song of mourning. It wasn't regret. It was a song of survival, of promises made in broken places and kept across impossible distances. It was for brothers lost in war, for children saved in smoky subway stations, for strangers who sat down with 2 coffees when the world looked away. The sound filled the hall like sunlight through a cracked window, imperfect but warm. Keanu leaned forward slightly, feeling every note thread through him, pulling up old pain, old gratitude, old dreams he didn't know he still carried. Tears blurred his vision, but he didn't look away. Neither did anyone else. The younger veterans, the older ones, even the staff members who had wandered in to watch, all sat transfixed. Frank played as if he was telling a story without needing a single word. A story about endurance, about choosing to stay when it would have been easier to walk away, about how sometimes the greatest victories aren't shouted from rooftops, but whispered quietly in subway stations and charity halls. The song climbed, dipped, and carried the room with it. When the final note hung trembling in the air, Frank lowered the harmonica slowly and stood still, breathing hard, but smiling through damp eyes. The room stayed silent for a long moment, not out of awkwardness, out of reverence. Then, one by one, they began to clap, soft at first, then stronger, until the entire hall was filled with the sound of hands meeting hands, a human thunder that made Frank bow his head and press the harmonica briefly to his chest. Keanu wiped at his eyes, smiling. Not the smile he wore on movie sets or red carpets. A real one. Grateful, proud, because he knew, everyone in that room knew, that Frank hadn't just played a song. He had lived it. He had offered up every note like a prayer, a thank you, a promise kept, across decades and scars and second chances. And somehow, impossibly, it had been enough. It had always been enough. After the applause faded, the room settled into a kind of sacred stillness. Frank didn't rush to leave the stage. He stood there for a while, just breathing, soaking it all in. Then he tucked the harmonica gently into his jacket pocket and stepped down. He didn't need to say anything. The song had said it all. Keanu made his way through the crowd, weaving between chairs and whispered conversations until he reached Frank. They didn't hug. They didn't need to. Frank just gave Keanu a long look, full of things he couldn't have said even if he tried. Keanu smiled and nodded once. It was enough. Around them, people started coming forward. Men with service pins on their jackets, women carrying stories in their eyes. They shook Frank's hand, clapped him on the shoulder, pressed crumpled thank you notes into his palm. No one asked for details. No one demanded explanations. They just honored the music, honored the life that had quietly woven itself into the fabric of their own, without most of them even knowing it. Later, after the gathering dispersed and the hall emptied out, Keanu and Frank sat together on the steps outside. The sun was dipping low, setting the sky on fire with streaks of orange and gold. Frank pulled the harmonica from his pocket and turned it over in his hands. His thumb traced the small inscription inside the cover plate, the words Keanu had commissioned from the craftsman. "Thank you for saving me." Frank chuckled softly under his breath, shaking his head. "You've saved yourself, you know. Keanu said quietly, watching him. Frank looked over at him, one eyebrow raised. Keanu shrugged. "I just got lucky enough to find you again." Frank's mouth twitched into a half-smile. "Lucky, huh?" "Yeah," Keanu said. "Lucky." They sat in silence for a while longer, watching the sky darken. Finally, Frank lifted the harmonica once more and played a few soft notes. Not a song this time, just a simple melody, a heartbeat in sound. Keanu closed his eyes and listened, letting the music stitch itself into the memory of the day, into the long, winding story they had written together without even meaning to. And as the last notes faded into the warm evening air, Keanu realized something. This wasn't the end of Frank's song. It was just the beginning of a new verse. A verse written with second chances, quiet courage, and promises kept. A verse filled with light instead of sorrow. Frank tucked the harmonica away again and stood, offering Keanu a hand up. Keanu took it without hesitation. Together, they walked down the steps into the cooling evening, side by side, no longer strangers bound by a forgotten rescue, but friends connected by something deeper. By a song that would never leave them. By the kind of gratitude that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. By the kind of love that never really lets go. And somewhere deep beneath the city streets, in the bones of the old subway station where it all began, a small wooden bench waited. A bench where strangers left notes of hope. A bench where promises lived on. A bench that would hum with silent music for as long as people needed to remember that even the smallest acts of kindness could echo across a lifetime. The weeks that followed the veterans' gathering slipped by gently, almost like a song playing just beyond the edge of hearing. Keanu kept visiting Frank. Every Tuesday without fail. Sometimes they met at Frank's small apartment, the one filled with sunlight and the soft scent of old leather and sheet music. Other times they returned to the subway bench, where memories still seemed to hum from the metal rails below. Frank seemed lighter now. Not younger, not even healthier, but lighter somehow, like a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried too long. Keanu noticed it in the way Frank smiled more freely, in the way he greeted the other veterans at the community center with a slow, easy nod, in the way he played the harmonica, not as if clinging to it, but offering it. It became a ritual between them. Frank would play a few notes, usually something slow and wandering, and Keanu would sit back, letting the music say everything words could not. It was during one of these visits, a rainy afternoon when the city streets were slick with reflections, that Frank did something Keanu didn't expect. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the harmonica. The harmonica Keanu had commissioned, restored, inscribed. The harmonica that had carried them back to each other across a gulf of 25 years. Frank turned it over once in his hands, his fingers tracing the worn edges lovingly. Then he held it out. "For you," he said simply. Keanu blinked, thrown off balance. He shook his head instinctively. "No, Frank, that's yours." Frank smiled, slow and patient. "It's always been yours, kid," he said. "You just didn't know it." Keanu stared at the harmonica. The metal gleamed faintly under the low lights of Frank's small kitchen. The inscription inside, barely visible now with use, still read, "Thank you for saving me." Keanu swallowed hard. He reached out, taking the harmonica carefully, reverently, as if it were something sacred. Because it was. It wasn't just a gift. It was a legacy. Frank nodded toward it. "Play it," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Play it when you need to remember." Keanu closed his hand around the harmonica, feeling its weight, feeling everything it represented. The subway crash, the rescue, the years that followed, the silent, stubborn hope that had kept a broken man returning to a bench, week after week. Keanu looked up at Frank, his throat too tight to speak. Instead, he simply nodded. "Promise." Frank smiled again, and this time there was nothing sad about it. Only peace. Outside, the rain pattered against the window, a soft rhythm like distant applause. Inside, two men sat across from each other, connected by more than memory, more than chance. Connected by the quiet truth that sometimes the smallest act, the smallest song, could change everything. Forever. Keanu kept the harmonica tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket from that day forward. It was never flashy, never obvious. It simply became part of him, like a quiet heartbeat he could carry wherever he went. In moments when the world felt overwhelming, when cameras flashed too bright, when headlines twisted too sharp, he would slip a hand inside his jacket and brush his fingers against the worn metal. And remember, not just Frank, but the boy he had been, the boy who had been lifted from the wreckage by strong, calloused hands, the boy who had been saved by a song. Frank, for his part, continued to show up at the community center every week. He taught harmonica lessons to anyone who wanted to learn, teenagers grappling with anger, veterans nursing invisible wounds, mothers trying to find their voices again. He didn't charge a dime. He asked only that they promise to pass the music on. One afternoon, Keanu arrived early at the center and stood just outside the doorway, listening. Inside, Frank was laughing, a low, rusty sound that Keanu hadn't heard in years. He was showing a young girl how to bend a note, encouraging her as she struggled, her brow furrowed in determination. Keanu leaned against the doorframe and closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. This, he realized, was what healing looked like. Not grand speeches or sweeping gestures, but small, stubborn acts of kindness, shared songs, shared silences, shared hope. Later that day, as the sun slipped low over the city skyline, Frank and Keanu sat together once again at the subway station. Their bench, the bench where Frank had waited for so many Tuesdays, stood quietly under the station lights, worn smooth by time and stories. Keanu pulled the harmonica from his jacket and turned it over in his hands. He smiled. "Play it," Frank said, grinning. Keanu laughed under his breath. "I'm not you, Frank," he said. "I don't know if I can do it justice." Frank leaned back against the bench. "It doesn't have to be perfect," he said. "Just has to be true." Keanu lifted the harmonica to his lips and blew a tentative note. It wobbled a little, uncertain. Frank chuckled but said nothing. Keanu tried again. This time, the note came out clearer, softer, and, as he played, clumsy, offbeat but real, Frank closed his eyes and let the sound settle into his chest like a blessing. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't a tribute. It was a thank you. Simple. True. The song didn't last long. Just a few slow notes drifting up into the cavernous ceiling of the subway station. But when Keanu lowered the harmonica, Frank opened his eyes and gave him a small, proud nod. "You remember?" Frank said softly. Keanu tucked the harmonica back into his pocket. "I'll never forget." They sat there a while longer, watching the world rush by. Trains roared past. Strangers hurried along platforms. Life moved on. But for a little while at least, time bent around them, holding them, honoring them. Two lives stitched together by a promise, by a song, by something far bigger than either of them alone. And somewhere deep in the station's bones, the music lingered. It always would. Some promises are never forgotten. Some heroes are never named, but their songs echo forever. Frank never wanted recognition. He never asked for gratitude or a spotlight. He carried his memories quietly, tucked into the corners of an old harmonica and a subway bench. Yet, without knowing it, he had changed the course of a life. He had planted a seed of resilience, of hope, of kindness that would ripple outward far beyond the day he pulled a scared little boy from the wreckage. In a world where so many people pass each other without seeing, Frank chose to reach out. He chose to act. He chose to believe that a small kindness could matter, even if no one else ever saw it. And it did. The echo of his promise. The quiet strength of a man who kept showing up even when the world forgot him became the foundation for something beautiful. It became music. It became memory. It became a life lived in gratitude. Frank's story reminds us that the greatest heroes often go unnoticed. They are the ones who sit beside us in our darkest moments, the ones who offer a steady hand when everything feels like it's falling apart, the ones who play a broken song into the silence because it is the only gift they have left to give. And somehow, it's enough. More than enough. As you listened to Frank's story, maybe someone came to mind. Someone who showed up quietly, maybe without fanfare, maybe without you even realizing how much they mattered at the time. Maybe it was a neighbor who left a meal at your door when you were hurting. Maybe it was a stranger who held your hand in a moment of fear. Maybe it was someone you never even got the chance to thank. Today, we honor them. Today we remember that the small, unseen kindnesses shape us just as much as the grand, visible ones. Heroes aren't always wearing medals. Sometimes they carry worn harmonicas. Sometimes they wait on benches with nothing but hope in their hearts. And sometimes they leave behind songs that never truly end. They live in us, in our choices, in the way we show up for each other, in the way we carry the music forward, note by note, promise by promise. So today, we ask you, has someone quietly changed your life without you realizing it? Share your incredible story below. You never know who might need to hear it. And stay tuned, because next time, we'll bring you another unforgettable journey of healing and redemption. A story of a war veteran burdened by psychological scars and abandonment, whose world changes completely when Keanu Reeves steps into his life. Not with judgment, but with compassion, dignity, and a second chance. You won't want to miss it.